Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Neuroscience of Mental Health. Today is lesson 7 about trauma in the brain. And all of us are going through a little bit of traumatization right now. And so I want to get a basic understanding of what happens during trauma in the brain. So there are two things that take place primarily, and this has to do with those neurochemicals. We talked about little messages to the brain telling it what to do. When we are in that moment of experiencing trauma, something that is immediately traumatizing, the first thing is that we get that cortisol message to the body, and it says to the brain and the body, let's move, we got to get out of the way. It's kind of that fight, flight, or freeze, get out. um, and it also says stop to our traditional memory system. So our hippocampus is where we usually store memories, and it stops, the cortisol stops that. And the other message that comes through is adrenaline, and adrenaline says let's get ready to move. It keeps with that fight, flight, or freeze, get us out of the way, or fight. Um, and it also says remember this to the amygdala, which is sort of where the glowworm is. And so it's that we want to remember this moment. We want to remember it because it's threatening, because it's traumatizing, because it's dangerous. So what this does is it primes our brain so that in the future, when we come across something like this, we'll know to immediately react, to go fight, flight, or freeze. So we have that glowworm with the red alert, and this is what's happening when she's going red alert. So what happens is that anything that's happening in that moment of initial trauma, of traumatization, when it's that short term, like think about individual trauma where somebody's being abused, or somebody, you see a car accident, or you're in that immediate trauma. Your brain wants to remember that so that it can be prepared for the next time. And so it imprints sort of everything that's happening at that moment, and it sort of aligns that with danger zone. So all of those social threats of respect, equity, alliances, control, territory, and similarity also get imprinted as stronger triggers for the next time. So we have to recognize our brain is meant to go sort of in a wave of being prepared for trauma, energized, and then it's supposed to go back into sort of this calm phase. So we go into waves. When we have constant trauma, when we have sort of that consistent and we don't get to go back to the calmness, it becomes toxic for our brain. It's not really good. Often, control is the thing that becomes the biggest trigger for our brain when we experience trauma, because we often feel out of control. And I think a lot of us are feeling that a little bit now. We don't know when this is going to end. We don't know, what we can do. It's hard to know. We get different information each day about COVID, and so it feels like things are a little bit out of control. We can't control when we go see our friends. We can't control. So that becomes something that becomes a little bit more of a trigger for us, feeling out of control. Um, there are three types of trauma, and they can compound. So there's individual trauma. So if you've gone through an accident, if you've gone through abuse, if you've gone through something that was a traumatizing event, now it could be consistent, but an individual trauma is the trauma that is experienced by one individual, a person. There is collective trauma. That is kind of like 9/11. It's the Holocaust. It's when I actually spoke in Flint, Michigan, and we talked about the water crisis as being a collective trauma. It's when a whole group of people go through a trauma together. And COVID-19 certainly is that case, that so many of us are going through this collective experience of trauma together. And then there's transgenerational trauma. And what that is that trauma can actually get passed down through the genes. They've done studies with mice to show that trauma can actually get passed down. So if you think about the Holocaust, if your grandparents were in a concentration camp, there are going to be certain triggers that might be stronger for you because of that transgenerational trauma, that those triggers were passed along in that sort of remember this passed along as triggers to you. So all of these traumas can fit together and they can impact the way we respond. Um, there's an experiment called the ACEs. They did a study years ago looking at adverse childhood experiences, and they have a checklist of if you've gone through these before your 18th birthday, and for each one, and they address childhood trauma and personal trauma, and then of other people within your family. And what's amazing about this study is how they link the higher your ACEs score, so you get 1 point for each of the things that you've experienced, the higher your ACEs score, the more likely you are to experience issues later in life, both physical and emotional and mental health issues. So it doesn't mean that if you have that score, you're going to, but you have to recognize that you have to build up some resilience against that, that it puts you at risk if you have a high ACEs score for having trouble later in life. So recognizing what your score is sort of an interesting experience, and recognizing that I have to fight against this. I have these certain traumas within my life that I have to recognize and I have to work on in terms of my own mental health and physical health. Um, in terms of protective factors against trauma and against later in life having issues, resilience is probably the biggest protective factor. There are a number of them. Supports are really important. Having somebody in your life that you can confide in, that matters, that you feel confident with, makes a big difference. But resilience, how well do you respond to challenge? So are you able to take something that was traumatic and be able to say, okay, I can deal with this. I'm going to use my strategies, I'm going to use my supports, and I'm going to come out ahead. Or is it somebody, Chris Waddell, who was a guest a couple lessons ago, talks about, are you a victim or a survivor? And so how are you going to respond to challenge? What is your resilience? That is a huge protective factor against later on having problems. It's a protective mental health issue. So it's important for you guys going through this collective trauma right now to understand that it does have an impact on your brain, that you are feeling some of those effects, and that's okay. To be able to, on one of Chris Waddell's calls that I was on, there was a young woman who said, "How do I stop from being angry about all the things that I'm missing?" It's okay to be angry. It's okay to have emotions and respond to, this is a traumatic experience in some ways for some people, but then how are we going to move on from that? How are we going to use strategies to feel like we are in control as much as we can be within this, to keep our mental health, to keep those tools in place? So our reflection is, how do you feel? How do you feel that you're being affected by the trauma right now? And what strategies can you use to help yourself? We will see you in the next lesson. Thanks.